Don't forget that the research paper is due 1 week from tomorrow, so that's March 19th, so before spring break. That way it's not hanging over your spring break time off. So make sure to be working on that. If you have any questions or if I can help in any way, let me know what I can do to help you as you work on writing that. Essentially, guidelines available on Blackboard, and I've also included a grading rubric on there to give you an idea of what I'm looking for in each of the sections of the paper and how I will be grading it. So if you have any questions about either of those things, let me know what I can do to clarify and maybe help you understand what to really focus on in putting your paper together. So we turn now in the second half of the course to the 19th century. Now I'm getting closer to the modern times, and between now and spring break, a lot of our focus will be on the 19th century, and then after spring break, the 20th and the 21st century. A lot of things taking place from the 19th century on in church history and the impact that Christianity has on a large portion of the world. And when we think about some of the political things that are going on, a lot of what we see in this time period is more and more separation between Christianity and government, between church and state. And so one of the things to really pay attention to here is how, as these new countries are being formed, like the United States, and we'll talk about Germany and some other, and then there's Latin American countries being formed at the same time, more and more of these countries that were originally under the leadership of a government that was looking to the church for guidance, they more and more start separating from them. One of the first places we see this is in the end of the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire had been around since the middle of the Middle Ages, essentially, and had been not really been a significant force in Europe for quite a while by the time we get into the 19th century, as more and more nation states were developing. And especially with the rise of Napoleon in France in the very early 18th century, he sought to gain more power and more land for France and involved himself in a variety of military actions over those first decades. And some of that included taking territory from the Holy Roman Empire. Right? Largely the Holy Roman Empire, what we think of today as Germany and some of the nations that are surrounding Germany. So as he is taking land, as he's kind of making some conquest, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, a man named Francis II, decided that what he would do would be to abdicate as emperor and essentially end the Holy Roman Empire. And then he would become the emperor of Austria. And so at this time we're seeing this power that had been around for almost 1,000 years starting to fall apart. And some of that empire, as it's falling apart, goes to Napoleon. Some of it eventually forms the country of Germany. And particularly out of the upheaval of these Napoleonic Wars, two new countries were created. Well, no, new countries were created, two I want to focus on. The first is that of Italy. Sometimes with the development of these new countries, specifically Italy and the other one being Germany, these new countries often ran afoul of the Pope, who saw these efforts as trying to limit his authority, because these were often created as countries distinct from papal authority. The Risorgimento in Italy in the middle of the 1800s was an attempt to bring Italian unity. There wasn't a country like we conceive of Italy today. But with this kind of consolidation of the country of Italy, there was the question of the papal states. These were regions in Italy that were controlled by the Pope. In this reorganization, this consolidation in Italy, eventually the Pope lost a majority of the Papal States and really only held on to the Vatican and Vatican City, with some minor holdings here and there. So at one time, even though we think of the Pope leader of a religious church, Vatican City, of course, very important for that today, at one point he was a political leader as well. But with this kind of reorganization in Italy, that comes to an end. On the other hand, when we look at Germany, Catholics face a different situation there. Many of the regions of Germany, of what became Germany, were Protestant and had been from the time of Martin Luther. But as Germany's kind of unifying out of the end of the Holy Roman Empire, a lot of Catholics faced persecution because of the policies of Otto von Bismarck. Essentially, he feared Catholic power, specifically in Austria, but also was very supportive of the Risorgimento in Italy. And so he engaged in what has been known as the Kulturkampf, which is kind of a culture war, culture struggle, where Germany and Catholicism completely broke away. Germany broke diplomacy with the papacy, expelled monastic orders, so monks and nuns were kicked out, and cut any monies given to the clergy. Now, eventually some of these were restored, but for a time, it was a very anti-Catholic period. And out of that, many Catholics from Germany traveled to other places, including the United States. Not only is there this kind of new countries, new independence going on in Europe, similar things are happening in Latin America as well. Now, as Gonzalez points out, there were tensions in a lot of these Latin American areas between new immigrants and descendants of older immigrants, right? People that had been there for a while, their families had been there, and now here are these new immigrants coming in. And so there's tensions there as well. There's also some concern because a lot of the religious or the Christian decisions were not made locally. They were made by the church in Europe. And so when Napoleon's wars threw Europe into confusion, Latin American colonies decided to set up their own independent governing authorities because Spain and Portugal and the papacy were so focused on what was going on in Europe. Now, often these revolutions and there's these independence movements really didn't result in freedoms for the common people. It was just kind of a shift in leadership. It was kind of new boss same as the old boss, where the power is now in the aristocracy, the nobles, the powerful landowners in these regions, as opposed to being in Europe. Within all this push for independence, the Catholic Church on the ground got involved with it, right? So the priests, the local leadership, found themselves some supporting and some on the other side. And many of the bishops actually returned to Europe after independence. The lower level leadership, right, the priests, tend to decide with the common people, right, the people that are pushing for independence. The upper level, right, the bishops and higher, usually sided with the imperial powers. Right? They supported the status quo. Now, eventually, even though through most of the 19th century, the popes are supporting these colonial powers, they're supporting Spain, Portugal, eventually the popes do recognize these new countries and send new bishops to them. But for a time, a lot of the focus, a lot of the things that the church was focused on in the higher levels of the hierarchy was trying to maintain the colonial powers. with these new countries, with this new leadership that's kind of coming from the ground up, there were a lot of developments of these devotional practices outside of the institutional church. And so we kind of see the continued survival of practices, indigenous practices in Catholic clothes, so to speak. And so it's these kind of old traditions from the Incans, the Mayans, other types of kind of hybrid movements that developed through colonization, often held within the context of Catholicism. Now, these new governments that developed often claimed Catholicism as the national religion. But in later years, a lot of that started to break apart due to the conditions in Latin America and some of the positions that the Roman Catholic Church took.